I realize that the title of this video is very ambiguous and could refer to more than a dozen things at this point. Because whether it's racism, transmisia, ableism, or misogyny, Ian has done it all and has never shown any remorse or genuine desire to fix, well, anything. But I'm not here to talk about all that. Oh no. I'm here to talk about one of Ian's earliest atrocities. I speak, of course, of the fact that Ian is a sexual predator who confessed after being Me Too'd in 2019. Though, before we can get around to discussing that, I just need to give a content warning for the following topics: sexual harassment, gaslighting, domestic abuse, racism, transmisia, queermisia, and fascism. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I also need to explain why I won't be referring to Ian as Vaush throughout this video. Ian has gone on record stating that the name Vaush comes from Vorcanada, something that's not all that surprising considering Vorcanada used to be his old Twitter handle. What is shocking, however, is the fact that Vorcanada is apparently a fictional black woman Ian made up, making said branding a form of digital blackface. Sadly, I had to use it in the title in order to alert people as to which Ian we're talking about, but that is as far as I go, and I expect the same from people in the comments down below. So with that out of the way, hi there, my name's Ethel Thurston, and today we'll be talking about the way in which Ian was Me Too'd in 2019, trivialized said sexual harassment as drama, and continued to attack his victims after he claims to have realized that he had sexually harassed them. As always, everything I state throughout this video is fully referenced. I do this so you don't have to take what I say on any sort of faith. You can always check my claims, something I feel is particularly important due to the nature of today's video. The bulk of what we'll be discussing today comes from a post written and published by Ian himself to his subreddit on the 10th of September 2019, titled A Retrospective on the Sexual Harassment Drama. And we'll be returning to that title later, but first I just wanted to jump straight to Ian's confession, which reads: As of March 31st, 2019, I have admitted I sexually harassed Poppy and acknowledged my wrongdoing. I have since gone on to reaffirm my wrongdoing dozens of times, on stream and off, to as many people and audiences. Now, one thing that's missing from Ian's post is the extent of what he did to Poppy, because whilst any form of sexual harassment is too much, Ian took things to an extreme degree. I just want to read you 2 excerpts from Poppy's testimony to show you what I mean. Be warned, they are incredibly graphic. Also note, a copy of Poppy's full testimony can be found in the script linked below, along with links to an archived version. It's rather long and covers many things, hence I can't read it all, but you should certainly give it a read when you have the time. Poppy opens her testimony with: After I blocked Ian for trying to groom me when I was going through a traumatic experience as an autistic young person, he told me he wanted to prolapse my anus and rape me for months on end. Did not stop until the mods got involved, and never apologized. Poppy then goes on to elaborate on that specific aspect, adding that I never once responded to any of his advances, and he constantly tried to pressure me into sending him nudes, as well as sending me fake-out pictures that looked like his dick, and pics of him in the shower, and posting pics in public chat of his ass. I said multiple times, no. After I blocked him, that's when the worst of the abuse started. He tried to alienate me from my friends in the community and spread lies that I was a racist and an anti-communist. He tried to convince everyone I was a liar just starting drama. He would at me things like he wanted to fuck my ass until it prolapsed, knowing that I had been raped by my ex-boyfriends this way, and I'd take this as a serious threat of rape. Key note, nowhere does Ian challenge Poppy's accusations of rape threats in his Reddit post, likely due to the fact that he was made to stop by others, meaning there were witnesses. In fact, nowhere are details of what he actually did to Poppy shared in said post. with Ian merely talking in vague terms, which is another fact we'll be returning to later. But focusing on the confession itself, that alone should have ended Ian's career as a streamer. Why? Well, because once you've shown yourself to be a sexual predator, you cannot be trusted in any sort of position of power. That's whether you're a politician, a doctor, or a streamer. Anything that could give you undue influence over others, like audience members, is something you have to be barred from for life. Because a sexual predator, whether they claim to have seen the error of their ways or not, can't be trusted, period. The risks involved are too great, and said positions are a privilege, not a right. Sadly, we don't live in a perfect world, meaning that besides doctors who risk losing their medical license, most people in positions of power or influence, like Ian, are completely unaccountable. About the worst that can happen is they lose patrons, which, considering how toxic Ian's fanbase is, yeah, not likely to happen. That said, it's still worth a try, and if nothing else, I can at least warn others to keep them safe. Because it's important to note that Poppy isn't Ian's only victim. Another person who came forward is Pastel, someone who Ian goes out of his way to disparage throughout his Reddit post, claiming that they simply lied. Ian concludes his piece by deciding for himself that his actions towards Pastel do not constitute sexual harassment, stating, "While I cannot see eye to eye with you in regards to your characterization of my behavior as sexual harassment, that does not mean I treated you well. There were clearly points of discomfort I pressed through, warning signs I should have heeded but didn't, and signals I prioritized over others." I just need to cut in here since what Ian admits to doing is quite literally a textbook definition of sexual harassment. If you pressed through other people's discomfort towards your sexual advances, that means you are making unwanted sexual advances. That is the literal definition of sexual harassment. And the fact that Ian acknowledges this means that on some level, he was aware of what he was doing at the time. That none of his fanbase seemingly called him out on this basic fact is really telling of just how toxic parasocial relationships between streamers like Ian and their fan bases really are, particularly when mixed with rape culture like this. What's more is, this comes after Ian has attacked Pastel's character, undermining their perception of what was done to them. Ergo, this is just straight up gaslighting, something Ian continues to utilize throughout the rest of his statement, adding that, "It's obvious I caused you distress, you fasted afterwards. I don't accept responsibility for your decision to purge yourself of sin, but I do accept responsibility for leading our relationship to a place where you felt that was necessary. I was inconsiderate and brazenly confident in the worst ways, and for that I am sorry." This is Ian telling Pastel, his victim, how they felt about what he did to them. This is supposed to be Ian taking accountability for his actions, yet what it really boils down to is a continuation of violence against his victims. So when Poppy mentions 2 other victims who want to remain anonymous, considering that Ian has not only confirmed that he had sexually harassed both of the people who had publicly accused him, but that he continues to target them whilst pretending like he's apologizing, I have no reason whatsoever not to believe her. It is fucking terrifying to go up against your abuser, particularly one with a large platform. Ian has done nothing but prove himself to be a sexual predator on multiple accounts, and there is nothing in this post or in his present behavior that leads me to believe that he has changed. Ian didn't say sorry in this thread because he realized he'd done something wrong, he said sorry because he got called out on it. Though, before delving into all that, let's consider what makes an apology an actual apology. For me, there are 3 main criteria. An apology should clearly lay out what the person apologizing has done in order to demonstrate that they actually understand. It should focus entirely on their actions to ensure that they're not merely using the facade of an apology to further attack their victims. and an apology should show clear evidence of the steps they've taken to ensure it won't happen again. Ian's Reddit post failed on all 3 accounts. Returning to what I said earlier, nowhere in Ian's post did he describe what his sexual harassment consisted of, but more important than that, he refuses to include a link to Poppy's own testimony or even show it. That is, with one exception. Towards the end of his post, Ian includes screenshots of Poppy's terms regarding what he needs to do in order to prove to her that he's taking his sexual harassment seriously, but only of those terms, and only so that he can label them, and by extension Poppy, as being bad faith. Which, I've gotta say, lovely way to slip in a personal attack against your victim by stating that they have an ulterior motive in trying to hold you accountable to the sexual harassment you admit to. And herein rests the problem for Ian. Said terms come from the very same testimony I read from earlier, meaning Ian was not only aware of its existence, but had to go out of his way to very selectively take said screenshots and re-upload them, just so he could limit the information his audience had access to. So in spite of him claiming to understand the severity of his actions, Ian is still trying to control the narrative by effectively denying Poppy her voice, her autonomy, in talking about what happened for herself. All as a means of downplaying the very real horror of his actions. This Reddit post is an extension, not an addressal, but an extension of Ian's violence against Poppy. Ian just flat out refuses to acknowledge the true extent of his actions, meaning that any apology he gives is simply hollow, something he's doing for show. He's saying sorry not because he actually understands that what he did is wrong and that he needs to be held to account, but because he believes that to be the best thing for his brand. He's still going out of his way to hide the true nature of what he did from his audience because he's afraid of being judged for said actions. What makes things worse, however, is the fact that he feels it's okay to take what he wants from the very same thread, to rip those terms out of their full context, all as a means to help him further demonize his victims. It is a visceral demonstration of Ian's take what he wants mentality. Speaking of which, we also have the fact that Ian is only apologizing after orchestrating months of targeted abuse against Poppy and his other victims, taking things beyond the sexual harassment. And yet, not only does he fail to apologize for said incitement against Poppy, he even goes out of his way to try and defend some of it, as seen in a section titled, "Apologize for attempting to silence Poppy before she could report your harassment." Here, Ian discusses a couple of Discord posts made in March of 2019, in which he stated, "Should I at Poppy in Discord and tell her I'm onto her shit?" Followed shortly by, "Might scare her into shutting up." Ian's excuse in said Reddit post? Well, his followers told him not to, at which point he realized he could potentially lose money and support, so he backed out of that specific form of harassment. However, to many of Ian's more radical followers, this set the tone for how they should engage with Poppy and the rest of his victims. This told them what Ian himself wanted to do, something they could potentially do for him whilst giving him plausible deniability. It also reset the standard for the rest of his audience, including those who told him no, since anything else he suggested would no longer seem so extreme. He was, in effect, numbing them through exposure as a means to enable future acts of abuse or calls to action. Calls such as the following. I think I would appreciate it very much if somebody compiled into a Reddit post a bunch of evidence that Poppy is a habitual liar, all the times they switched up their accusations, made outrageous claims, acted outright toxic and unstable, expanding on the doctored/edited logs, etc. Something I can disinterestedly throw at all the people she messages in a desperate attempt to get me cancelled. It'd be some work, but it could save effort down the road. Then we have this screenshot taken in July, in which Ian attacks a random person he assumes to be Poppy. Reminder that Ian himself clearly stated he'd realized that he'd sexually harassed Poppy on the 31st of March, yet here he is, in July, continuing to attack people because he thinks they're her. And nowhere does Ian even attempt to wrestle with said violence. Nowhere does he apologize for how he directed a hate mob at her and those who supported her. all of that gets brushed under the rug, which is the very opposite of laying out one's actions. As for focusing on the harm he caused, we see that being violated in his apparent apology to Poppy, in which he states, "You and I were both going through a difficult time while we were friends, and I failed to respond appropriately to your needs and desires at the time. I was lascivious, inconsiderate, pushy, and at times single-mindedly sexual. I thought I was being considerate and attentive. I would ask, at times, whether I was being too much. But the complexities of pushing boundaries are such that that simply wasn't enough. It was wholly irresponsible of me to treat you in the way I did, and I apologize for not being more mindful of your boundaries." Notice the way Ian refuses to apologize without trying to sneak in the insinuation that he stopped and asked Poppy if he was being too much, implying that she was at fault for him not stopping. This is in spite of the fact that he would target and harass Poppy with threats of sexual violence after she blocked him and had told him to stop. This is not a genuine apology. This is merely another way for Ian to frame Poppy as irrational and bad faith, whilst painting himself as a good guy. It's an attack being presented as an apology, which is worse than simply not apologizing, which is a sentiment that sums up this entire post. I mean, let's do a section by section recap. The first section is a rundown of general events, avoiding the specifics of Ian's actions. The second section is Ian finally confessing to having sexually harassed Poppy. The third and fourth sections are Ian engaging in semantic nitpicking about the form of sexual violence he engaged in. The fifth section is him denying sending dick pics, in spite of Poppy having stated that he sent fake outs, so he's not even addressing what his victims actually said. The sixth section is him denying having demanded sexual images from two of his victims. The seventh section is him admitting to having leaked Poppy's real name before downplaying said action and claiming that the doxing was actually someone else. The eighth section is him denying having threatened to kill Poppy. The ninth section is him denying having sped up his rebranding to put distance between himself and the accusations being levied against him. The 10th section is him denying having attempted to silence Poppy. The 11th section is him denying targeting and grooming vulnerable individuals. The 12th section is him excusing why he hasn't offered his victims an apology, even in the 5 months since he himself claims to have realized he sexually harassed Poppy, with him instead continuing to attack her and his other victims. The 13th and 14th sections are his apologies to Poppy and Pastel respectively, both containing further attacks upon them. Lastly, his 15th section is his conclusion, in which he preemptively whines about anyone who might be critical of his fake-ass apology. Had Ian actually intended this as an apology, the only sections he should have included are those detailing what he did, him apologizing for his actions without attacking his victims, and him showing how he intends to do better. That is all this Reddit post would have been were it genuine, but it isn't. Ian merely sees this as another way to further attack both of his victims, something that is very clearly not evidence of change. And since we're on the matter of Ian's refusal to actually change, we also have the way in which Ian very openly declares Poppy's terms. The terms of someone he openly admits he sexually harassed to be bad faith. To be clear, those terms were a direct apology to both Poppy and other victims, both private and public, a willingness to learn about sexual boundaries and consent from feminists, a long overdue break from sexual commentary, jokes, and slur usage, i.e. listening to the victims, criticizing others who endorse rapists, a 5-figure anonymous donation to a sexual assault legal clinic or charity, since Ian claims to make 6 figures, revocation of every time he has smeared Poppy or any other victim involved, and to cease using his website CSS and source code, which he stole from I Lied About Cake. Now, I don't know about that last point, and I don't really care, but to class these terms in general as bad faith, when Ian should have actually been stripped of his platform entirely, shows just how little Ian actually cares about the harm he caused his victims. These terms already compromise so much in allowing him to keep a position of power, Yet Ian feels so entitled to make even more demands of the people whose boundaries he violated. I can't believe this has to be stated, but sexual predators do not get to set the terms of their redemption. Period. Ian has no right to class anything as bad faith, and him doing so is merely an attempt to further poison the well. This also shows a complete refusal to change how he is. I mean, just consider point 2, a willingness to learn about sexual boundaries and consent from feminists. That's a completely reasonable demand, particularly considering how Ian himself asserts he simply didn't realize that he sexually harassed Poppy until years later. That is a weakness he himself admits to, and yet something that would actually fix that is smeared as bad faith. What's worse, however, is that Ian is doing this while simultaneously declaring that he has the right to judge whether or not he sexually harassed Pastel. Again, Ian claims he didn't realize he sexually harassed Poppy for years, and yet, rather than take a step back and go, well, maybe I'm not the best person to judge what is and is not sexual harassment, he forces himself upon the topic as an authority. Because this post is not about learning and moving forward, it's about putting on a show to pretend like the issue has been resolved, all whilst driving the knife even deeper. The same goes for the way this entire situation has been presented by Ian. Just looking at the title of this Reddit post, a retrospective on the sexual harassment drama, reveals so much about Ian and his perspective on sexual violence, that he feels comfortable labeling sexual harassment, something he confesses to having done, as drama. This is outright trivialization that is once again being drawn upon by Ian to paint his critics as having blown things out of proportion. Someone who is genuinely sorry about the hurt they have caused does not refer to said suffering as drama. Only someone looking to attack and smear their victims would do such a thing. And we have to recognize that this is taking place in a society in which cis white men with influence, like Ian, has spun the lie that false rape or abuse accusations are common. That is the very system of violence that Ian is tapping into when he refers to his victims calling out his history of sexual harassment as drama. Ian is very publicly weaponizing rape culture to his own end. We also see this in how he repeatedly sets up his audience to ignore any criticism his shitty apology would inevitably receive, stating the following: "That's it. That's all I have to say about this. I've refrained for the longest time from typing out my retrospective on this drama because it may invite more scrutiny, more out-of-context screenshots to explain away or fit into the timeline, more accusations and such. Ask yourselves, why would Ian be afraid of further scrutiny if he were actually willing to better himself? Surely, if he were genuinely sorry, he'd do all he could to learn from his mistakes." Fact is, Ian is fully aware of what he's doing, as shown in the following. "I know for a fact that people will interpret this as an effort to smear my detractors, but I don't feel those accusations come from a place of good faith. Whether or not there is backlash to this post, I feel there genuinely is nothing else for me to say on the matter." So not only does he describe precisely what he's doing, but he does so to preemptively attack anyone who would dare point it out, declaring them to be operating in bad faith. The fact that Ian spends more time bemoaning how transparent his abusive behavior is than he does pretending to apologize demonstrates very conclusively that Ian only cares about how this post makes him look. That is all. His pretense to care about his victims is just that, a lie, and not even a good one at that. Though why should it be? His toxic fanbase will defend whatever he does, so long as he tells his audience that his critics are acting in bad faith and can thus be ignored. And it is fucking frustrating, as a victim of sexual violence, to see how Ian was allowed to get away with it. How said sexual harassment was just buried and forgotten, only brought up now and then by a few who actually cared to remember. Which brings us round to why I'm bringing this up. Why am I talking about Ian being Me Too'd in 2019 for events that occurred around 2017 when it is now 2022? Why does this matter? Well, regarding the dates, I was a little busy in 2019 and wouldn't come to know who Ian was until I dealt with his equally predatory prodigy, Xanderhole, in 2020. So I wasn't able to cover things at the time. But just because a few years have passed, that doesn't mean I shouldn't cover them now, particularly considering how the matter was never actually resolved. As for why I felt the need to do a video discussing these events, first and foremost, I felt the need to warn others. I didn't know about this until 2021, and I imagine there are others in the same boat, even among Ian's fanbase. Not everyone knows they're defending a sexual predator, though a lot of them certainly do. Regardless, I feel it's my duty as someone with a platform, as small as it may be, to try and warn as many people as possible in an attempt to keep them safe. That has been a constant of my work on this channel, alerting people to predators within certain communities. And it is effective, at least to a degree. How can I say that? Well, just look at how hard Ian fought to bury things when they first came to light. That, in and of itself, tells me that as unlikely as it may be to happen, there is a part of him that fears being held to account for his sexual violence. Because all it takes is for that first stone to come loose at just the right time for his entire world to come crashing down around him. Now, will that first stone be dislodged by me? In all likelihood, I doubt it. But if there's even the slightest chance to reduce the power of a known predator, you fucking bet I will take it. I'm also bringing this up as a warning to the left, or at least what would class itself as the left. Ian is a reactionary LARPing as a leftist, so the idea of any community that willingly includes or even centers him is leftist is highly questionable. But either way, to any espousing themselves to be leftists, this is a warning to not let predators like Ian into their spaces, and there are a number of reasons for this. To begin with, it marks their space as somewhere which is unsafe for victims of sexual violence. Ian is a self-confessed sexual predator who has never made genuine attempts to make amends. When you include someone like him in your spaces, you are excluding victims of sexual violence who know what Ian is, while simultaneously endangering those who don't. The hard line is, you cannot support Ian whilst claiming to be a safe space for victims of sexual violence, at least not with a clear conscience. A fact made all the worse when we consider which demographics are most likely to be targeted with sexual violence. LGBT+ folk, people of colour, neurodivergent folk, and the economically disadvantaged. These are the groups most harmed when you welcome a sexual predator into your communities. What's more is, Ian being allowed to take up space in said communities has made them incredibly toxic. Make no mistake, Ian's ability to get away with being a self-confessed sexual predator has undoubtedly played a large part in why he feels so comfortable enacting extreme levels of violence against actual leftists. By doing nothing, we have effectively given this monster permission to do whatever he wants, safe in the knowledge that, in all likelihood, there will be zero repercussions. That he can just say what he wants, abuse who he likes, and get away with it. There is a direct link between Ian being allowed to get away with sexual violence and Ian making statements such as the following. And this was the point where I'd originally intended to play a clip in which Ian labels the LGBT+ community, specifically the trans community, as cancerous and subhuman, arguing that it needed to be excised from leftist spaces. The reason I can't do that is because when I uploaded the clip to YouTube to generate auto captions as a time saver, it got flagged as hate speech. Not to worry, I filed for manual review explaining the whole situation, only for YouTube to confirm that it was indeed hate speech and tell me that my usage was irrelevant, thus it would still count as a warning against my channel. Hate speech is, of course, speech that is intended or likely to incite violence towards a marginalized demographic, in this instance, the LGBT+ community. I have linked a copy of the video in the script. I've also included the transcribed version of what I'd intended to play just below Poppy's testimony. But yeah, Ian's homomisia and transmisia is so horrific that queer people aren't even allowed to play what he has said in order to critique him. I don't see how things can get any clearer than that, to be honest. Anyway, back to the video. Statements that in turn exclude even more people from leftist communities and resources by making them feel unsafe. Because when a reactionary predator is allowed to take up space in so-called leftist communities, most marginalized people will abandon said communities out of a sense of self-preservation. And that's without even getting into the way Ian himself has personally set out to silence leftist voices like Professor Flowers. Anytime Ian wants to shut down criticism, all he has to do is tell his followers that all his critics are acting in bad faith. It's what he said about Poppy, it's what he said about the trans community in the clip I just played, and it's what he will almost certainly say about me when this video goes out. Because it's his go-to, his default hand wave. And why wouldn't it be? It's a big part of how he escaped accountability for being a self-confessed sexual predator. Ian is what happens when we fail to act on cases of sexual violence, because someone who is an abuser in one way is very often an abuser in others. That is why 40% of police are known to engage in domestic violence, 4 times the national average. This is not shocking, it's not surprising, but it is something we can act upon. We can choose to stop humoring him, to stop debating him, and start treating Ian for what he is, an abusive monster with zero sense of accountability. Because until we do, so many communities are simply not safe. And to anyone still tempted to argue that a sexual predator is an asset to the left, even pretending like that's true for a second, for every mediocre white cis guy like Ian that's allowed to get away with being sexually violent and generally abusive, there are dozens upon dozens of far more qualified people they have harmed. Not only would getting rid of Ian benefit everyone, though especially his victims, in removing a sexual predator, but it would allow voices silenced by Ian to speak up and build something better. Black voices, queer voices, neurodivergent voices, people who actually have something to lose with the rise of fascism and aren't treating the entire thing like a fucking game. People with passion and insight. That's the left I want, something new, something greater than the usual cis white predators I've come to expect from the rest of society. I think that's something worth fighting for, so I say we should just get on with it. Ian needs to go. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Gerrit Van Vorst, Hannah Banghart, Spike Jones, Flynn, Higgins a Seagull, and Sosh Daniels. And for myself, Edita, and Levi, take care now.